Now, of course, that is a very contentious proposition. There's a lot of stuff built into it, a lot of scope for criticism, as I'm discovering. There is a sharp choice for us when we contemplate this option between the costs and risks of accommodation, and they are very significant, and the costs and risks of the alternative. In particular, can we, if the alternative, the most optimistic alternative from the 5 options I listed is 18th century Europe, that is the confidence that we could build, if we don't share, if we don't do the concept of power thing, we can run a balance of power system in Asia which doesn't get out of hand. Of course, I don't know. Maybe we can, and I think a very important argument is whether we can build a stable balance of power system that doesn't require us to accommodate China as fully as my model does. But the history is not on our side. There's a reason why the 18th century ended with the Napoleonic Wars, and why when the order that succeeded the Napoleonic Wars broke down, we got into World War I and World War II. And that is that really powerful modern industrial states are fantastically strong. They're far stronger than states were back in the 18th century, or the 17th century for that matter. And their capacity for destruction is very great. We didn't run the 18th century with nuclear weapons. Running the 18th century again with nuclear weapons is a very different proposition. But the costs and risks of accommodation are very evident, and I would say easy to exaggerate. It's possible to describe what I'm suggesting. In fact, someone has described this, what I'm suggesting, as Australia abandoning our values and disengaging from America. Are we abandoning our values if we suggest that the best order in Asia is for the United States to treat China as an equal? Well, it depends how you define our values, of course. I don't think I'm abandoning mine. We have to be very careful not just to slide into the Munich metaphor. The Munich metaphor is the most potent idea in strategic policy in societies like ours, and for very good reason. But if the Munich metaphor means that you never compromise, it means that you accept war in many circumstances where eventually history might judge you don't have to accept war. The reason it's so potent is that the judgment that we should have accepted war in 1938 is based on the proposition that we were going to go to war anyway. But to use the Munich metaphor in relation to the choice we now face is to judge that we're going to go to war with China anyway. Well, I think that's too gloomy a conclusion to reach. And to turn the argument over, sure, we've got to acknowledge the costs and risks of accommodation, and they are significant. I don't underestimate them. But we also have to acknowledge the costs and risks of competition. If you don't like the idea of accommodating China, are you prepared to accept the costs of competition and the risks of escalation? I take those risks very seriously. I also think we can manage the risks of accommodation, and that they're lower than people might think. Under my model of a 19th century Asia after a 19th century Europe model, the US stays engaged. It stays actively engaged. It is a major player. It has a big role in Asia, but it's there to balance, not to dominate. My model sees Asia working within a clear frame of norms. Those norms are essentially those set by the UN Charter. The norms that they require are not the norm that says you have to accept US primacy, but they are a norm that says you have to acknowledge the foundations of the UN Charter, and right at the core of that is the refraining from use of force in pressuring other countries. And of course, you can manage the risks of accommodation because there's always the option to move to containment if you have to. The whole idea of a concert of power is that if one player in the concert misbehaves, the others unite against them. What keeps the concert stable is the recognition by each player that if they step out of line, the others are likely to act in unison against them. So it's not quite as soft and cuddly as it looks. So I think we can manage the risks of accommodation, and I think we have to be very clear-eyed and very responsible in judging the risks of competition.